I'm Joshua Bartlett,
And I'm Graham Zismeda.
and we're going to be talking about the emissions reduction potential in the transportation sector. Just to give you some background of the current state of the sector, it's one of the fastest growing sectors. It's currently responsible for 5.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents, and the main reason why it's such a fast growing sector is because of the increase in personal vehicle use. This is one of the least efficient, most carbon intensive methods of transportation available. Just to give you a visual representation of where the transportation space falls in with the other sectors, it's responsible for about 18% of current emissions. And here's the modal breakdown across different countries of passenger kilometers, the way essentially people get around. If you look at the OECD, the vast majority is personal passenger vehicles, light trucks, and passenger cars. And in the non-OECD, the share of rail, buses, and minibuses is much larger. And you'll see even within the OECD there's a wide variety, because in the European Union, rail and buses have a much larger share than in the United States, where it's almost negligible. And we predominantly focused on the EU and the US, as well as China and India in our paper, and you'll see India is mostly dependent on buses, minibuses, and rail. And we'd like to see India stay where it's at in terms of its transportation mix. China, to a lesser extent, is also using these methods extensively, but they've moved more towards passenger vehicles as opposed to India. Looking at the energy mix in the transportation sector, the vast majority of energy comes from fossil fuels, diesel and gasoline, contributing to a majority of light road vehicle use. And this leads to a majority in passenger usage. But the most important takeaway is that 2/3 of the energy in this sector is lost as heat. And only about, 1/3 is actually the mechanical energy that's used in transportation. Looking at the emissions by country, we mainly focused on the United States, EU, and China because they're the three largest contributors. Additionally, we looked at India because while its current level is low, it's one of the fastest growing emitters. So this shows the emissions breakdown both for 2009 as well as 3 different future scenarios for 2050. There's the 60S scenario, which is assuming no additional mitigation, and it would lead to an increase in global temperatures of 6 degrees centigrade. There's the 40S, which is enough mitigation to keep global temperatures only rising by 4 degrees. And then finally, the ideal scenario of 2 degrees in additional temperature. And as you see in the 2DS, the transportation sector actually is producing less emissions than it currently would in an ideal scenario. This is just looking at some of our rationale for why we chose to look at China and India. Their expected transportation growth is much higher than developed countries, and this is strongly correlated with the GDP growth that you've seen in these countries. And as I said, some of the future projections, we're looking to see a vast majority of transportation emissions increases to be from the non-OECD countries. This is because they are rapidly urbanizing, their incomes are increasing, and we're also expecting to see passenger and freight overall double in the next 40 years. And over 90% of these increases are going to come from non-OECD countries. We use the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework for looking at mitigation potential in the transportation space. This is first looking to avoid transportation whenever possible, essentially reduce demand for transportation, and then shift transportation to less carbon-intensive methods when possible, and then when a carbon-intensive method is absolutely required, look to essentially make it as energy efficient as possible. This is a picture of what needs to happen in the transportation sector to achieve the 2DS scenario. You see the vast majority will come from improved strategies, having more efficient vehicles and using low carbon fuels. But in order to get all the way down to the 2DS scenario, we're going to need to implement shift strategies and avoid strategies as well. First, we're going to look at the avoid section. Essentially, this is any attempt to reduce demand for transportation, especially carbon-intensive transportation. A big part of this is exposing the true cost of transportation, either through congestion or distance-based pricing. Also, using less carbon-intensive road construction methods. And lastly, providing emissions calculators or more information to decision makers so they can calculate what the emissions impact of their infrastructure improvements is going to be. Some of the barriers to this is there's concerns that some of these policies will disproportionately affect low-income groups. Additionally, there's questions about where the funding will come from in low-income countries. And lastly, there's a variety of governance structures in the countries that we looked at. China's proven much more effective at changing the behavior of its citizens quickly and efficiently, whereas in the European Union, it's very decentralized, and there's a lot of stakeholders required to see any change. And lastly, our recommendations. In the United States, we'd like to see LEED type certification. This is a method of awarding best practices in the energy efficiency, building efficiency sector. We'd like to see something like this implemented in the transportation space as well. For China, as they continue to urbanize, and we'd like to see them to continue their efforts at emphasizing public transportation, smart urban planning, and continue to use two-wheeled electric vehicles as opposed to shifting to fuel combustion vehicles. And lastly, India has one of the largest highway networks in the world, so we'd like to see them use a lot of low-carbon road and rail construction methods, and also maintenance methods. And also we'd like to see them continue and use the same kind of urban planning methods as China as they continue to urbanize. And my colleague Ramsey will talk about the shift section.
Yeah, the shift set of strategies that we focused on really are primarily looking at shifting road transport to rail, and then also the use of bus rapid transit systems because of the low cost of implementing PRT systems. The barriers that we see really to the adoption of these strategies are lack of investment for public transport in the U.S. primarily, and possible market saturation for public transport in the European Union. Also, these strategies are most effective in areas that have high population densities, for instance, the eastern seaboard of the U.S., so they're not economically feasible in all areas. Also, the prevalence and increase of car culture, predominantly in developing countries like India and China, is a major obstacle. And the decentralized decision-making in India and the U.S. is also makes it difficult to have these integrated transport systems that are less carbon intensive. Our recommendations focused on, for the U.S., developing a multimodal transportation system to make it easier for passengers to choose public transport options as opposed to just relying on personal vehicles for transport. In China, providing incentives and promoting electric vehicle use, and really the infrastructure is important there. That's the most expensive part of electric vehicle implementation, and then also use of alternative fuels. And then in India, they use a lot of rail currently for freight transport, and there is a possibility that there could be a shift to over-the-road trucking like we rely on here in the States, which would greatly increase their emissions. And so really emphasizing continued reliance on rail for freight transport in countries like India and China is important. And last but not least, the improved set of strategies. This is really the most important part of transport mitigation, as we saw earlier. In 2030, the mitigation potential from improvements to transport systems amounts to about 2.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and then that grows to 7 gigatons in 2050. Mainly, this mitigation potential is going to come from improving the fuel efficiency of vehicles, as well as increased use of alternative fuels. The fuel efficiency improvements are mainly contributed by light-duty vehicles, the cars that most of us drive around. And they range from very simple changes like low rolling resistance tires and improved aerodynamics to more costly measures such as light weighting, reducing the weights of vehicles and also reducing the displacement of engines. But luckily, most of these strategies, except for the most expensive like electric vehicle use, have net negative costs. So there's actually the operational cost savings from reduced fuel consumption overwhelms the cost of the initial investment. So it's a money-saving option to adopt these strategies. We can see that just from LDV and light-duty vehicle improvements alone, the emissions reductions from the first bar there, first set is United States and then European Union and China. By 2030, these are making up the bulk of improved mitigation potential. The barriers to the adoption of a lot of these improvements in technologies are first a lack of political will for top-down regulation like the fuel economy standards that we have here in the US among developing countries. Also uncertainty about the operating cost reductions and also a problem of split incentives. This is primarily for heavy-duty vehicles. The split incentive problem is due to the fact that most of the operators of heavy-duty vehicles are not the owners, and so the people purchasing these vehicles don't have the incentive they're not able to capture the operational cost savings, and so they don't have the incentive to adopt more fuel-efficient technologies. And then in international air and sea emissions, there's no international authority to regulate those emissions, so it's challenging to do so. In maritime space in particular, maritime shipping, once ships are out of the zones of regulation of national authorities, they switch to the most carbon intensive and polluting fuels to save on operations costs. And also for alternative fuels, things like electric vehicles, they require extensive infrastructure investment, and a lot of the biofuels and other alternative fuels that have been used have other environmental impacts, and also some are difficult to integrate into the transport system. We can see here that luckily the emissions reductions that we have seen from light-duty vehicle fuel economy standards have been pretty significant, and we're on track to cutting in half the per kilometer carbon emissions in most of the major countries. This means that the bulk of vehicle markets have been adopting more fuel-efficient technologies, which is important, especially in the developing country context, because it may be a way to avoid the need for that top-down regulation, since most cars being manufactured today are already emitting less carbon than just 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So our recommendations for the improved set of strategies are encouraging alternative fuel use by increasing taxes on fossil fuel consumption, and also providing those subsidies to electric vehicle infrastructure. In the US particularly, we think that the light-duty vehicle fuel economy standards should be continued and extended. They've been successful so far. And we also like the strategy of pursuing similar regulations for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. In the European Union, expanding electric vehicle charging infrastructure would be really beneficial. And then in China and India, we found some interesting information about the potential for joint ventures between domestic manufacturers and major international companies to facilitate that technology transfer and allow the vehicles that are produced by domestic manufacturers in developing countries to achieve the same types of fuel efficiency and fuel economy as in major markets. And also the use of alternative fuels should be focused on those fuels that are easily integrated into the transport system. There are some emerging options like methanol and dimethyl ether that can be used to replace the gasoline and diesel that we're using currently, and emit less carbon and also come from renewable sources, which is promising. So to summarize, really in the void set of strategies, we're looking at reducing emissions, also reducing congestion. This is particularly important in urban areas. There's a lot of co-benefits that are provided by reducing the emissions from non-point sources. And then shift strategies, focusing on shifting demand to low carbon intensity modes of transport through the use of bus rapid transit and rail transport. Particularly in developing countries, we want to see the transport mix maintained and not a huge shift to reliance on personal vehicles. And in the improvements that we can make to transport technologies, there's an important benefit of enhanced energy security, which most countries find very attractive, especially if you're a net oil importer. So the co-benefits and energy security improvements really make a lot of the transport sector mitigation very attractive. And next, we're going to hear from our energy efficiency team.